Sandringham House stands in the Norfolk countryside, roughly 100 miles north of London, and by the years of King Edward VII's reign, it had already been Alexandra of Denmark's home for 4 decades. Queen Victoria bought the estate in 1862 for her son, then Prince of Wales, paying £220,000 for a 29-bedroom mansion and more than 5,000 acres of land, in part because she and Prince Albert believed the young couple needed a country home away from London and the benefit of open air. Alexandra arrived at Sandringham in 1863, 3 weeks after her wedding, moving into a plain Georgian house that her new husband would soon judge too small for entertaining on the scale he preferred. Within a few years he had it torn down and replaced with the red brick building that stands there now, completed in 1870 and expanded again after a fire-damaged part of it in 1891. Alexandra kept returning to Sandringham for the rest of her life, through her decades as Princess of Wales, through her years as Queen after 1901, and through her widowhood after 1910, until her own death there in 1925. Her formal obligations took place in London. The greater part of her actual daily existence took place at Sandringham. What follows describes a typical late morning in her routine there during the years of her queenship, built from household accounts, surviving letters, magazine interviews given by members of her staff, and the recollections of the family and courtiers who spent time with her, since Alexandra herself ordered her private papers destroyed after her death, and much of what can be known about her now comes from other people's records rather than her own. A visitor entering the house passed under a covered porch and into the saloon, the largest room on the ground floor and the one used for greeting guests. Stag heads lined its walls, portraits of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert hung near the fireplace, and a small balcony built for musicians looked down over the floor where dances had once been held before a separate ballroom was added in 1884. King Edward kept a weighing machine in the saloon and made a habit of weighing his guests when they arrived and again when they left, as a joke about how well they had eaten under his roof. Beyond the saloon lay the drawing room, considered the most impressive room in the house, with a painted ceiling, 2 fireplaces, white marble statues, and portraits of Alexandra herself, alongside her 3 daughters. The dining room, paneled in dark oak and hung with tapestries, sat further along the same corridor, and it was here, or in her own private rooms upstairs, that Alexandra took her first meal of the day. Alexandra's day at Sandringham did not begin at dawn. The housemaids, the kitchen staff, and the men responsible for the fires had usually been working for close to 2 hours before anyone approached the Queen's bedroom. A dresser came in a little after 7 with a jug of hot water and moved through the room with a particular kind of caution, because Alexandra had been partially deaf from childhood, and her hearing had continued to decline with every decade of her life. A quiet word from the doorway would not reach her. The women who attended Alexandra learned instead to let themselves be seen before they tried to be heard, to stand where she could catch sight of them and read their faces, since she depended heavily on watching a speaker's lips and expression to follow what was being said to her. Notes were passed where a spoken sentence might not register. Queen Victoria herself reportedly learned the finger alphabet used among deaf people so that she could communicate directly with her daughter-in-law without needing anyone else in the room. Deafness had become such a constant condition of Alexandra's life that, according to people close to her, she occasionally used it to her own advantage, appearing not to hear a remark she preferred to leave unanswered rather than responding to it directly. The curtains were opened slowly rather than all at once, a detail of etiquette that applied to most women of Alexandra's rank and generation, not to her alone. Her dresser drew back the fabric a little at a time, allowing light into the room in stages so that the change from sleep to waking did not happen too abruptly, then checked on her before preparing the rest of the room for the morning. By this stage of her life, Alexandra rarely rose before her husband had already left for the stables or the gun room, since the king organized his own mornings at Sandringham around the shooting parties that filled the winter months on the estate. On many mornings the 2 of them began the day separately and did not see one another again until much later. This pattern had developed over many years of marriage, and neither of them found it unusual by this stage of their lives together. Visitors to Sandringham consistently described a companionable working arrangement between Alexandra and her husband, made up of shared meals, shared children and grandchildren, and a shared devotion to the house itself, even as each of them filled the hours of a typical morning in almost entirely separate ways. Dressing was the longest single task of Alexandra's morning, and it required the help of several people. A senior dresser, assisted by one or two others, worked through a sequence that had barely changed in decades. Undergarments first, then a corset laced and adjusted to Alexandra's exact preference, followed by the many layers that made up a fashionable outfit of the period. Alexandra was, by every account, difficult to dress quickly, not out of vanity for its own sake, but because she was famous across Europe for her appearance and treated the process with real seriousness. She had been called the most photographed woman of the 19th century, and her taste in dress had already influenced fashionable society for a generation, first as Princess of Wales, and now as Queen. Her dressers therefore worked to a standard that went beyond simply covering her body. They were maintaining a public image that thousands of women outside the household tried, in one way or another, to copy. Part of that standard involved jewelry laid out and chosen fresh each morning. Ropes of pearls, a Byzantine-style necklace given to her by her father at the time of her wedding, and the many brooches and bracelets she had accumulated across 4 decades as princess and then queen. Unlike Queen Victoria, who had patronized British dressmakers almost exclusively, Alexandra ordered many of her gowns from Paris, considering French houses unmatched for evening wear, though her daytime clothing at Sandringham was far plainer and more practical than the elaborate dress she wore for court occasions in London. 2 physical details affected this process every single morning. The first was a scar on her neck, said to date back to a childhood illness or accident, which Alexandra disliked and covered with a high, closely fitted choker of pearls or jewels. She had worn her necklaces this way for so long, and with such consistency, that fashionable women throughout Britain adopted the same style simply because she wore it, most of them without knowing why she had started. The second was a limp in one leg, the result of a severe bout of rheumatic fever she suffered in 1867 after the birth of her 3rd child, which left her with a stiffened knee for the rest of her life. Alexandra developed her own particular way of walking to minimize it, and her clothes were cut and fitted with this in mind, so that the limp would be as unnoticeable as possible when she crossed a room. Society women found out about the limp too, and some of them copied it deliberately, adopting a slightly uneven gait that the press of the day nicknamed the Alexandra limp, with a few going so far as to order shoes with mismatched heels to reproduce the effect without any of the pain that had caused it in the first place. Once she was dressed, her hair was arranged by the same team of women, often into the low fringe across the forehead that had already become associated with her name in the same way as her necklaces and her walk. A light application of cosmetics followed, applied carefully enough that it would not be obvious to a casual observer, since visible makeup was still considered improper for a respectable woman of her generation, even one who was constantly photographed and closely watched by the public and the press. Alexandra had always been fond of walking, riding, and driving, activities that had helped her keep a trim figure well into middle age, and this was frequently cited by observers of the period as part of the explanation for how well she continued to look for her years. Breakfast came next, and depending on the season and on who was staying at the house, it was taken either in Alexandra's own rooms or downstairs with the rest of the family. When guests filled Sandringham during the shooting season, the household followed a more communal pattern, and the dining room filled with family members and visitors eating from dishes kept warm on a side table rather than served plate by plate. Her unmarried daughter, Princess Victoria, was almost always present. Victoria had become her mother's closest companion as Alexandra's hearing worsened over the years, and by this period in her life she rarely left Sandringham for long, having set aside much of her own independent life to remain near her mother. If Alexandra's elder son and his wife were in residence at York Cottage, the smaller house on the estate that had become their own home after their marriage, their children sometimes appeared at breakfast as well, since Alexandra's grandchildren were often close by during these years, and she made an effort to spend time with them whenever she could. At table, her deafness continued to shape the room around her. She was generally seated where she could see most of the people present and read their faces easily, and guests unfamiliar with her condition sometimes received a discreet word beforehand, so that they would not be offended if she failed to respond to a remark made from across the table or from behind her chair. One detail of the estate affected every meal and every appointment at Sandringham, and it involved a piece of family history that was frequently misunderstood even at the time. Every clock on the property, indoors and outdoors, was kept running half an hour ahead of Greenwich Mean Time. King Edward had introduced this practice soon after coming to the throne because he wanted more daylight in the evenings for the shooting parties he loved during the winter season, and the household simply called it Sandringham time. According to a popular rumor, the clocks had been set forward because of Alexandra's habitual lateness, on the theory that if every clock in the house ran fast, she might actually arrive somewhere close to the correct hour. This was not true, and people close to the family denied it directly at the time, but the story persisted because it fit what everyone already knew about her. Alexandra was late for almost everything. All her life, regardless of what the clocks around her showed, and the extra 30 minutes built into Sandringham's official day did nothing whatsoever to change that particular habit. After breakfast, Alexandra usually attended to her correspondence, which by this stage of her life had become one of the largest and most constant demands on her day. She had brothers and sisters living in royal houses across Europe. One brother became King of Greece. One sister married into the Russian imperial family and became empress there. And Alexandra kept up a steady exchange of letters with her siblings and their households, despite the distance and despite the political complications that came with having close relatives on foreign thrones. Her sister in Russia was among her most frequent correspondents, and the two women, who had grown up together in a modest household in Copenhagen long before either of them had any idea what kind of lives awaited them, remained close for the rest of their lives. Alexandra wrote a great many of her letters by hand at a writing table in her own sitting room, a room that held, along with her correspondence, the small personal objects that had accumulated there across decades. Photographs of her children and grandchildren in silver frames and mementos collected on her travels. By most accounts, her handwriting and her spelling were never her strongest points, though the warmth of her letters was usually enough to win over whoever received one. A great deal of her other posts concerned more ordinary matters: requests from charities and hospitals for her patronage, letters from acquaintances, notes that required only a brief acknowledgement. She had supported hospitals with her name and her presence since long before she became queen, including one founded in the 1860s to treat children with joint disease that was later renamed in her honor, and requests of this kind arrived steadily throughout the year. The Honorable Charlotte Knollys, who had entered Alexandra's service as a young woman decades earlier and had gradually taken on the duties of a private secretary alongside her original position as Lady of the Bedchamber, handled much of this correspondence directly, drafting replies for Alexandra's approval and managing the letters that came in and went out of the house each day. Knollys had by this point spent so many years in close daily attendance on Alexandra that she was, by a wide margin, the person who spent the most time with her of anyone outside her immediate family. Her discretion later proved decisive. After both Alexandra and King Edward asked that their private papers be burned following their deaths, it was Knollys who saw to it that the instruction was carried out in full. Alexandra also gave a portion of the late morning to practical matters concerning the house itself, though she left most of the detailed management of the estate to her senior staff rather than handling it directly. She was known among the people who worked for her for disliking change of any kind and for treating her household as something closer to family than employees, and servants who had been with her a long time were rarely replaced if she could help it. Members of her staff who left accounts of working for her tended to describe the same qualities: warmth, an informal manner that could surprise visitors accustomed to more rigid behavior elsewhere at court, and a memory for the individual circumstances of the people who served her, even those well down the household hierarchy. General Sir Dighton Probyn, who had managed the financial and administrative side of the royal household for decades, and who was known for his personal devotion to Alexandra, would sometimes be received briefly during this part of the morning if a decision required her direct approval. He had helped design and build parts of the gardens at Sandringham specifically for her, and the closeness between them was well known throughout the household, though Alexandra generally trusted him and the rest of her senior staff enough to leave most decisions in their hands without needing to review every detail herself. One appointment in Alexandra's late morning rarely changed, whatever else was happening at Sandringham: a visit to the kennels. The kennels had been built on the estate in 1879 to house around 100 dogs, whitewashed once a year and fitted with iron gates, a covered sleeping area for each dog, an open run for daytime, and a constant supply of fresh water. By the years of Alexandra's queenship, they held an extraordinary range of breeds. From tiny Japanese spaniels she could carry under one arm to large borzoi bred originally for hunting wolves in Russia, along with basset hounds, dachshunds, samoyeds, collies, chow chows, pugs, and fox terriers, among many others. Alexandra visited almost every day, whether or not the house was full of guests, and she usually brought Princess Victoria with her. She opened each kennel door herself, rather than leaving the task to the kennelman, and the dogs inside recognized her voice before she ever came into sight, so that barking would start well before she reached the row of kennels. She distributed treats from a basket as she went from one enclosure to the next, wearing a plain white apron over her clothes for the purpose, and a small number of favorites were let out to walk back to the house with her and Victoria, remaining with them until the household sat down for lunch. Among her personal favorites over the years was a large borzoi named Alex, a champion in her own right and one of the most photographed dogs in England at the time, given to Alexandra as a gift and kept close to her for years afterward. Another was a Japanese chin named Punch, small enough to be carried in her arms and included with her in at least one formal portrait, since her taste in dogs extended from these tiny companions to animals many times their size. When a dog Alexandra had been especially attached to died, it was buried in a small cemetery on the grounds, marked with a modest headstone recording only its name, its age, and how many years it had spent with the family, a custom that continued at Sandringham long after Alexandra's own death. The gardens usually took up whatever time remained before lunch. Alexandra had a genuine interest in gardening and had personally worked on parts of the grounds at Sandringham over the decades, including a set of topiary yews she planted herself near the dairy cottage, working alongside the men employed to maintain the rest of the property rather than simply issuing instructions from a distance. 2 ornamental lakes had been laid out for the king in the 1880s by a landscape gardener who specialized in artificial rock work, and their banks, along with the wider grounds, were planted in the fashion of the period, with lavender, roses, spring bulbs, and flowering shrubs providing color through most of the year. By the account of people who gardened alongside her, Alexandra was genuinely knowledgeable about plants rather than merely enthusiastic in a decorative way, and the rock garden built up around the lakes, with its imported stone arranged to resemble natural outcrops, became one of her favorite places to walk regardless of the season. Alexandra also rode well, and had done so since she was a young woman, though her limp and later her age limited how often she went out on horseback compared to earlier years. A walk through the grounds in late morning, sometimes alone, more often with Victoria or with whichever dogs had come up from the kennels, gave her one of the few parts of the day not arranged by anyone else. Sandringham's grounds had grown considerably since her arrival there in 1863, extending eventually across thousands of acres of farmland, woodland, and formal garden, and much of what she walked through by this point in her life resulted from choices she and her husband had made together over more than 40 years of shared ownership of the property, long before either of them had expected to become king and queen. By the time the household approached midday, the difference between Alexandra's private mornings and her public role as queen was already obvious to anyone who spent real time at Sandringham. In London, at state occasions, and in the ceremonial appearances that came with her position, she followed strict protocol, was watched constantly, and needed to present a formal, carefully managed public image to a country that had admired her for 4 decades. At Sandringham, in the hours before lunch, she moved through a routine that consisted mostly of the people and animals she had chosen to keep close to her for decades, a handful of servants who had worked for her for most of their lives, a daughter who had given up much of her own independent life to remain at her mother's side, and a house full of dogs that came running the moment they heard her voice. It was this version of her morning, private and largely unwitnessed by the public that admired her image from a distance, that the people closest to Alexandra remembered best after she was gone. When she was away from Sandringham for any length of time, whether in London or on the travels that took her to see her family in other parts of Europe, letters from her household often carried news of the house and its animals, a sign of how much she continued to think about Norfolk even when she was somewhere else. Sandringham was, by every account left by the people around her, the place she considered truly her own, chosen before she held any title beyond Princess of Wales and kept as a retreat long after she had become queen.